This is a joint effort between Professor Edward Telles and I to investigate a node hypothesis expressed by the following question. Does money whiten? To our knowledge, this paper is the first attempt to isolate the causal impact of money and income mobility on racial reclassification. Previous work has shown association, but not causation. So our presentation has the following structure. We start by giving some background on racial classification in Brazil. Then we state our hypothesis, describe our data source, present our modeling strategy, the derived results, and finally, our conclusions. 5 facts are relevant to understand the process of racial classification in Brazil. First, higher status are commonly associated to reclassification of race, especially in lighter categories. This is depicted by Brazil since the 1930s and less often for the US, although it has been increasing in the last decades. However, studies fail to point to what causes reclassification. Does social status shift race, or does race shift social status? Second, theory and evidence suggests that race is fluid in Brazil. By fluid, we mean that racial reclassification shifts depending on social status, region, time, and reporting methods. Such fluidity has been observed in Brazil and also in the US. Third, differently from the US, which has an ancestry-based schema of racial classification, in Brazil, race is mostly defined according to one's appearance or phenotypic traits. Fourth, previous theory and evidence suggests that money whitens, not only in Brazil but also in the United States. However, until now, there's no evidence showing what causes changes in classification. So you use a causal approach to understand whether income and income mobility causes racial reclassification of the same individuals over time. Our approach is the first to analyze socioeconomic mobility in racial terms. To be clear, we test 2 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 tests whether the level of income reported in the previous interview is related to the racial shift observed in the current interview. We test, therefore, if richer individuals are more likely to darken or to whiten according to their baseline income. Based on previous longitudinal evidence by Saperstein and Penner in a paper published in 2012, suggesting that unemployment and incarceration increase the chances to be darkening, while university degree increases whitening. We also test a second hypothesis to investigate if individuals who had positive income mobility are more likely to whiten or to darken. To test this hypothesis, we used linked data from the continuous PNAD, a nationally representative household survey quarterly conducted by the Brazilian census, fielded by the IBGE, which is the equivalent to the is the Brazilian census. So the survey covers about 200,000 households in 3,500 municipalities. We describe racial transitions for the entire sample, but we estimate models for just 10% of the linked sample, for which we observe variability in race and in individual income over time. It's also important to notice that race is reported by whoever answers the questionnaire. It's thus self-reported rather than heteroclassified. This table shows that 69% of the sample did not reclassify their race over the observed period. This means that 30% did. So 14% reclassified their race once, 12% reclassified 2 times, 3.75% of the sample reclassified 3 times, and 0.82%, or about 6,000 individuals, reclassified 4 times. This other table shows the first and the last reported races in our data set. Browns account for most of the sample, about 377,000 cases. But indigenous, which account for 38%, and blacks had the highest share with 32%, transitioning to another race, in this case transitioning to browns, when comparing the first and the last reported races. So this in the previous slide look at all individuals and not only at those who made at least one racial transition between 2017 and 2019. As I previously mentioned, our analytical sample is based on about 10% of the total sample reported in this table. Our causal approach is based on conditional loaded models estimated for observations which had at least one racial transition over the period. This class of model is useful to estimate the causal impact of covariates that have changed over time for specific individuals, here indexed by I. Variables that have not changed over time, such as region, schooling, and sex, are not specified in the model. After all, if these covariates have not changed, they have not impacted racial recategorization. So in this equation, we have the following. Subscript I denotes the groups and T indexes the observations within groups. Our dependent variable, YIT, takes on value 1 for those who have recategorized their race in relation to the previous interval. A row vector of covariates, represented here by XIT, includes the year of the interview, the previous and current reported race, categorical variables indicating the relative hourly wage in the previous interval, and the individual's relative income mobility. Before estimating the models, we excluded cases with two error sources in race reporting. We adopted two rules to define causes with measurement errors in the race variable. The first rule follows Spanner and Sapirstein in their paper published in 2016, and the second rule excludes unlikely or rare racial transitions. So blip 1 marks cases where the respondent has the same race in both the previous and two classifications and subsequent two classifications, but a different race in between. So for example, if someone classified over time as white, white, black, white, white, that would be a blip 1. Blip 2 marks cases where individuals have reclassified from Asian, white, or indigenous to black, and vice versa. Here, 0.6% of the sample had blip 1, and 0.39% had blip 2. So about 1% of the sample had at least one of these two kinds of measurement error. It's a small share of the sample, but for the sake of rigor, we excluded them anyways. To highlight our results, we simulate what the probability of racial lightening or darkening would look like as a function of income levels and income change or mobility. By using unconditional probabilities, we assume that individual fixed effect or the intercept is 0. Specifically, our counterfactual scenarios let the quintiles of hourly wages in the previous interval and the terciles of hourly wage changes to vary, while keeping other control variables at their most prevalent values. So we operationalize our results by simulating what would happen to unconditional probabilities of racial transition as the quantiles of income and income mobility change. In other words, we are interested in understanding whether individuals who had higher mean income were more likely to transition to a different race, and also whether those who had the largest change in income were more likely to move to a lighter or darker race category. Here in this graph, white diamonds and circles show probabilities of whitening for blacks and browns, while dark squares and triangles show probabilities of darkening for whites and browns. The test of our first hypothesis thus shows that first, probabilities of lightening and darkening are higher for those who had higher wages in the previous interval, Second, brown to black transitions become more common than white to brown transitions after the third quintile, where there's a crossover between these two probabilities of darkening. Third, notice that blacks have the overall highest probability of shifting to the brown category, as shown in the line marked by white diamonds. To test our second hypothesis, we predicted the probability of racial shift as a function of income mobility. So this image shows that cases who had negative income mobility, here in the first tercile, over time had lower likelihood of shifting their race than those individuals whose income increased between intervals, in the third tercile. So in sum, we've restated that racial classification is fluid by showing that 30% of the cases in our nationally representative sample have shifted their race at least once, and at most 4 times between 2017 and 2019. We also conclude that the impact of money on racial classification operates through whitening, but also through darkening. Those with higher incomes in the previous interval and those who had positive income mobility are about 20 percentage points more likely to darken and to lighten than those with lower income in the previous interval and who had negative income mobility. Finally, we find that browns are more fluid than whites and blacks in terms of darkening. That is, browns are not only more likely to darken with money than whites, but also more likely to darken than blacks. Thanks for your attention, and please get in touch for further questions or exchanges.